Good evening, buonasera a tutti. We are meeting here tonight for our last meeting in this year within the series of lectures in memory and celebration 50 years of Nostra Aetate. This is the last because the concert will not be held in May as it was supposed to do, but it will be next autumn, and we will email you the date, the day when we will know it. This meeting is organized by Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies of the Gregorian University and by the Ecumenical National Office for Interreligious Dialogue of the Bishops' Conference of Italy. I am Massimo Gargiulo, a professor of Cardinal Bea Center, and tonight I'm taking Director Philip Renche's place. He is in Poland with Cardinal Koch for the very important ILC meeting, and he asked me to greet and welcome you all, and of course our guests. Tonight's topic is the impact of Nostra Aetate in South Africa, and it is of great interest since the exit from apartheid solicited South Africa people to find ways of living together. And in the series of lectures about Nostra Aetate, we wanted to see from different perspectives how that document was and still is a proposal of a new starting point. So we are very grateful to our guests who will speak us about the way a document on religious dialogue works in a country where they're going through the progressive building of living together. So I will give first the words to Rev. Simon Donnelly. He will speak briefly about South Africa, and let me just say something about our guest. He is at home here because he was a student in this university, and now he's a parish priest in Johannesburg, and he is priest in 3 different parishes, and now he's also working for the Holy See in the Anglophone section. So, thank you.
So good evening to everyone. And it's really nice to be back here. I have to say the lecture theatres look much nicer than when I was a student. A lot nicer. So it's good to be back at an alma mater university and to be with friends and colleagues. A real pleasure to share this platform with, I don't think Rabbi will take offense if I say that he's really the rabbi of the parish where I was parish priest. When I first met him, I said, "You are the rabbi here," and I guess I'm the parish priest. I was anyway for a while. But also with an esteemed member of the same Catholic congregation, Mrs. Alina Kearns, and her husband who is here, Kevin. The parish is Our Lady of the Wayside, as you may have seen on the poster, which is an unusual English translation of the Italian title, Madonna della Strada. The parish was named Madonna della Strada after the title, obviously, from the Gesù, the church where Ignatius of Loyola is buried, St. Ignatius and Francis Xavier. And I was there for 2 years. I met the Kearns family in the middle of 2011 and Rabbi Goldman the following year. And just on a personal note, I'd like to acknowledge the 2 colleagues and friends here and their families, but also many others, fellow believers and neighbors in Johannesburg who have immeasurably enriched my life as a person and as a Catholic and as a priest. And I do think that we priests are incredibly spoiled and blessed to have so support, spiritual and otherwise, shown to us. And I feel blessed to be a Catholic priest who's experienced the moral support of his neighboring rabbi, I think one could say. That's how it felt, and it still does. Very briefly, South Africa, which may not be familiar to everyone, is considered perhaps to be the origin of the species. So people have lived there for the last 100 millennia or so. We have a place called the cradle of mankind, or humankind, where the earliest forms of the species have been found in the record. But our earliest occupants, we'll move quickly into the modern moment, but were hunter-gatherers, Khoi and San people, Bushmen, and sometimes called Hottentot, but Khoi and San peoples, certainly for the last 30,000 years or so. And then into the Common Era, so by 500 AD, or in the Common Era, black South Africans, well, there was no country then, but African pastoralists, Bantu-speaking peoples were well established in the subcontinent, having come down mostly the eastern coast of Africa along the fertile coastal areas and then stopped where the continent stops in our country. And then in the late 1400s, a Portuguese explorer came past, who was blown past the tip of the continent, and so he called it the Cape of Storms, Bartholomew Dias. And just 10 years later, another Portuguese explorer came past, and this time it was a beautiful day, and so he called it Cape of Good Hope. So when you go into the Palazzo Apostolico, and to the third floor, the Terza Loggia, where Pope Francis works and the popes traditionally live, if you see the map of the tip of Africa, it does say Cape of Good Hope. The map was painted 100 years before the first of the sort of colonial masters arrived, which was, in fact, on this very day, today, 464 years ago. A man called Jan van Riebeeck came with some ships from Holland, not because they wanted a colony, really, but because they needed fresh vegetables for their sailors. And so on the 6th of April in 1652, these Europeans came and settled reluctantly and then stayed. And so a colony was formed. And the history is complicated and painful in many ways, but that is where the European settlements began in our country. And then a heavy injection of French Protestants, Huguenots, who came also in the late 1600s, religious refugees in many ways. And this is part of the cultural mix of the country, which we want to talk a little about today. In the very end of the 1700s, at the time of the French Revolution, the British powers thought it wise to preemptively take over this colony from the Dutch. So after 150 years or so, we became English, effectively, and they then decided to stay. And so we have this double European heritage with our African heritage from the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Calvinists mostly, and English by way of the British settlers who were largely Anglican and Methodist and Presbyterian. So there it is, our history in a few words. Just to tell you that in the most modern part of our story, in the 20th century, after two extremely grim wars between the Dutch descendant settlers, as we call them, the Afrikaners, who deeply resented the presence of the English. After these two Boer wars, the word Boer just means a farmer, these two farmer wars really, two Boer or Dutch republics and two English colonies together were formed into a union in 1910. And finally, by referendum in 1961, South Africa, or the majority anyway, decided that they would like to be a republic, no longer a constitutional monarchy under the British Crown, but independent. And that's what we inherited. This is all before I was born. And this is the country that I grew up in until the most perhaps definitive moment in our recent history, which was also this month, 22 years ago, 27th of April, when for the first time everyone in the country could vote. black and white and everyone. And we received a new president and all kinds of new things, President Nelson Mandela. The last thing just to say, for those perhaps who haven't, why would one, seen or paid too much attention to South Africa, which is very far away, we have these three large-ish cities and many other settlements. The country is 1 and a bit million square kilometers, so about 5 times the size of Italy, about twice the size of France. Cape Town, the first city, the mother city. Johannesburg, the largest city because gold was discovered in the 1800s. And Durban, the coastal city, which is our point of reference for all things east. So the largest settlements of Indian immigrants and laborers and workers, now a significant community. Religion-wise, you may know, but the country is about 80% or so Christian, but that means a lot of different things. So broadly, very broadly construed. The population would be today, I think the speakers would agree, about 80 to 85% black South African, and with significant minorities then, the white folks about 6%, and mixed descendants about 3 or 4%. Indian about the same, and then many other hues of the rainbow in between. So we like to call ourselves the Rainbow Nation. And of that grouping then, Catholics are a minority, but of the Christian churches, as a single church, the largest of the single churches, so about 7 to 8% of the country. That's all I think we need to say about South Africa. We need to hear from our speakers, and so we'd like to, in a moment, if with permission of the moderator, hear from Mrs. Alina Kearns, and who will talk to us, certainly with her experience as a Catholic. I should say that for the Christians, again, broadly construed in the country, the dominant history is not Catholic at all, but is rather Calvinist, so by way of Holland and the Dutch countries. In fact, for a long time, Catholicism was regarded as somewhat threatening and certainly not very popular. The most English-speaking Christians would have been Anglican or Methodist or Presbyterian. We used to joke under the old South Africa, I'm sure it was like this when you arrived, that for the old government, as it was then, the white nationalist, mostly Afrikaans, that is Dutch descendant government, there were 3 big dangers. There was the swart gevaar, which means the black danger, meaning all of the black South Africans, who were obviously the majority. The rooi gevaar, the red danger, meaning communism, coming to us from somewhere. And then the last of them, possibly the worst, was the Roomse gevaar, the Roman danger, which meant the Catholics. And so the government was really afraid of all of these, and Catholics were among them. All right. I think I'd like to hand over to you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is very personal, known, not as broad. I thank you for giving me this opportunity of sharing my experiences of Judeo-Christian relationships in my life. I am Roman Catholic. I was born in Johannesburg, South Africa, of Italian immigrants from Santa Aetate, Puglia. The family settled in a fairly new area with a mixture of European immigrant families, South African English, and Jewish families who were already 2nd and 3rd generation South African. Jewish and Christian children attended the local schools and interacted in both the classroom and on the sports field. A few years later, I attended the local Assumption Sisters Convent to obtain a Catholic education. Despite being a Catholic environment, there were a few Jewish girls attending school. As there were no Jewish private schools at that time, it was common for both Jewish girls and Jewish boys to attend the local convent or Christian Brothers College. This would have been in the 60s. When Mass was being celebrated, the Jewish students were not obliged to attend and stayed behind in the classroom. They also did not attend our daily religious instruction classes. On thinking back, it saddens me that the Jewish students benefited from learning all about our Christian beliefs, yet we did not learn any of theirs. It was a great opportunity lost. Throughout our secondary and tertiary education, this would have been the 70s, there was constant contact with the Jewish community. Our neighbor was my father's accountant for over 30 years. My brother and I grew up with his sons and were often in each other's homes. My father dealt mainly with the Jewish community and was respected for his work. My mother was employed by the Spitz family for over 35 years. Their relationship was very close, that we were often invited to family functions, weddings, bar mitzvahs, and of course the odd funeral. It was at this time that many Yiddish expressions were heard at home, and many of the great Jewish feast days and traditions were discussed in our home. There is a great similarity between Jewish and Italian families. Both have strong family ties and a strong sense of faith being at the core of the family. I don't only speak for myself, but for many Christians that through schooling or the workplace interact with the Jewish community on a daily basis. We were all very aware of our different faiths. Gifts and greetings were exchanged at the appropriate festivals. There was always a great respect for each other's faith, even though neither had heard of Nostra Aetate. I have resided in a predominantly Jewish area for over 30 years, this is since 1982, for no other reason that the house suited us, was close to our family and our church. There were other Christians in the area at the time. Surrounding the greater area, there are synagogues and churches within walking distance of each other. However, in the past 15 years or so, the area in which I live has become very Orthodox, and to date, we are one of the few Christian families still living there. We have established a strong and mutual respect for each other. Last October, the Shabbos project was celebrated throughout South Africa and indeed internationally. We were privileged to be invited by our closest neighbor, with whom we have a close relationship, to join our fellow neighbors to partake of the Shabbat dinner on the Friday evening. The road was closed off and a long table set up in the middle of the road. We had about 60 people attend, and what a joyous dinner with family and friends in the true Jewish tradition of prayer and song. We were very pleased to be included and have been invited later this year. A Jewish friend of mine of many years, whose husband started the first infertility clinic in South Africa, and indeed was of great help to me personally, was a teacher at the local yeshiva college and taught me many of the Jewish traditions and inspired me to learn more about the faith in conjunction with my own Christian beliefs. It was because of her influence that I developed a keen interest in Jewish studies, which then led me to Bat Kol in Jerusalem. The Bat Kol Institute in Jerusalem exists to foster Jewish studies, defined as the study of the Word of God within its Jewish milieu, using Jewish sources, ancient and modern, with the help of Jewish and Christian scholars. The reason for these studies is that Christianity is rooted in Judaism as a plant is rooted in the earth. It cannot live apart from the soil in which it is planted. I attended the Bat Kol program in Jerusalem during July of 2011 and 2012 to study the books of Genesis and Exodus, and have furthered these studies in Johannesburg at the local Bat Kol Institute. This entails lectures which span over 10 months of the year. I was fortunate enough to meet a group of young Italians at the Bat Kol Institute in Jerusalem during 2012, who are finalizing their master's and PhD degrees in Judean studies. One young man, Benedetto Ligorio, and I think he was also an alumni of this university, introduced me to the research done on the ancient Jews of Puglia. Imagine my delight at knowing that my ancestors lived so closely with the Jewish community of the time. I am personally doing research on these ancient Jews of Puglia and hope to someday go on a pilgrimage of the ancient sites within the Puglia region. I have always felt a nearness and great affinity with my Jewish brothers and sisters. It is a particular joy for me that Pope Francis too has such a great love and closeness for and towards the Jewish people. It is only by his continued example that Christians will learn to respect the Jewish people and truly understand the meaning of Nostra Aetate. And here I ask that our bishops, priests, and rabbis will lead the way forward for all people to truly understand this message. Presently in South Africa, there is interfaith dialogue between the bishops and rabbis, and we pray that it continues so that we can filter down to the people and bring a message of understanding and acceptance of each other. I have been to Israel and in particular Jerusalem 5 times, and each time it is like returning home. I have studied there, traveled as a tourist, and have twice gone on pilgrimage with our Catholic Church. Each time I am in the Holy Land, I experience a new spiritual pull and return home full of promise and increased faith. In November last year, I attended a funeral in a Catholic church. The eulogy was delivered by a rabbi who ended off by saying, and I quote, "There are only 2 religions, one good and one bad. May we all choose the good religion." I was very moved by these words, and we should strive as one people to be good to each other and respect our differences. With the world in such turmoil, the message of goodness is sorely needed for us all. Shalom and blessings. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, Father Donnelly, who I spoke about earlier, and I just want to tell also that he is a PhD in linguistics, and it was professor of linguistics at the University of the Wits, and from, as I told you before, 2003, he was seminarian in Rome, and then what you already know about him. So, thank you, Father Donnelly, and we are very forward to hearing for your paper.
One could observe that in South Africa, as in so many times over the centuries in Europe and elsewhere too, there was something particular about the Catholic community, the Catholic Church, which, as I've already alluded to, didn't sit well with the state, with the government. And it seems to be, and it is perhaps the experience still in a remoter way of Catholics, because Catholics seem to have this allegiance to an outside power. So they are parts of congregations locally, churches, parishes, under a local pastor, a bishop, and we have 27 dioceses in the country, 27 bishops. But then they also have this allegiance to an outside figure, who is the Roman pontiff, who for the longest part of our history was very far away. He still is far away, and was Italian. And although we have a very sizable Italian immigrant community, especially in Johannesburg, but in Cape Town and other places too, the whole Pope thing was a very Italian business. And he did his thing and we did ours. And so the government tolerated this mostly, but there was a lingering thought that, as it has been for political figures over the many centuries, that if this Pope needed Catholics to do something, and this would conflict with the state, then they might just listen to him and not to the state. And so for the nearly 50 years of apartheid, this political system of enforced racial separation in South Africa, not always, but often, the bishops were quite outspoken, Catholic bishops, and certainly were not interested in having black and white Catholics separated from each other. However, because of the laws that were very thorough in South Africa, it is often the case, even in the parish that we shared, right, until not long ago, that because areas were defined according to the color of people who could live there, black and white and colored and Indian Catholics didn't know each other very well, and in some ways still don't. For 22 years now, the system of apartheid has been legally finished, but the effects linger and will do for a long, long time. It's an experience for let's say, a white Catholic to live in communities which he didn't grow up in or have changed a lot in recent years. And so I will just offer very briefly something anecdotal from my background. I'm 1 or 2 years younger than Mrs. Kearns, all right, 3 or 4 years younger. And I come from a different part of the country, and so although Rabbi Goldman is, I think he must speak for himself, an adopted Johannesburger, and Mrs. Kearns is originally a Johannesburger. I'm not. I talk funny, and I come from Cape Town. And so the experience growing up in Cape Town, I was born in 1968, 3 years after Nostra Aetate had been signed. The ink was barely dry. The 21st Ecumenical Council, the Universal Council of Bishops, the Second Vatican Council was finished, had been for 3 years. What did I know about this groundbreaking event or about Nostra Aetate or anything else? I wasn't even born at that point. But in 1968, which was a very strange year for all sorts of reasons, I came into the world and grew up in a family that seemed quite normal and seemed to love God, and we talked about him, and went to worship on a Sunday, to Holy Mass, and I went to state schools. Catholic schools were kind of out of the question economically, so differently to Mrs. Kearns, Alina, I went to government schools, and in the 1970s and into the 80s and even 90s, we still had a system called Christian National Education, which was broadly Christian in its scope. It was definitely not Catholic, roughly Anglican, Methodist, what in the English-speaking world we sometimes called, and it's not intended to be particularly unfriendly, but it's sometimes called a WASP system, so white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The schools I went to, the primary school, I walked past the local shul every day on the way to my primary school. It's not a shul anymore, but my school was called Golden Grove and Stewart Road in Cape Town. And in those days, because it was a white area, all the students and the pupils were all white. The only thing which was different was that we went to Mass on a Sunday. We went to a particular community with German sisters and priests who very consciously were trying to overcome the effects of apartheid. And so there were families from the Cape Flats who were colored, and black families, and so on. And it was a healthy experience, but I didn't realize how unusual it was. I went to a high school, which was for boys and girls, the first mixed school in terms of gender anyway in Cape Town, a state school, a good school. And for the 5 years I was there, we had one black student. And that was because his father was the ambassador to an artificial country which South Africa invented inside its own borders called the Transkei. If I go back to those schools, at my primary school, the students are all colored, and Indian and black, and 2/3 are Muslim. I had never really met any Muslims when I was growing up. And the high school represents far more the diverse nature of South Africa. But in both places, Catholics were a minority and slightly suspicious. People couldn't quite put their finger on it, but it had something to do with what we inherited, I suppose, from all of the struggles and conflicts in Europe, be that in England, in Britain, or elsewhere. The sense was that, first of all, Catholics had this foreign chappie, this Pope, who they were loyal to, who became a much more visible figure when Pope John Paul was elected in 1978. He was Polish, he wasn't Italian, and he began to go out into the world. But still, Catholics, they had other books in their Bible, which most Protestants didn't seem to have, which refer to the Septuagint canon of Scripture. And then they had this devotion to the saints, which most Christians didn't seem to have. And then they seemed to have great reverence for the Mother of Jesus, for Mary, which was also somewhat suspicious. And so we felt we needed to sort of say, well, actually, I'm Catholic. That was the sort of the opening line of conversations. It wasn't necessarily unpleasant. We certainly weren't persecuted, but it was regarded as, not quite right. There was a club in Cape Town, quite a prestigious club, which would definitely fit under the label of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And I suppose we're proud to share with Jews the fact that neither of us were allowed to be members of this club. No blacks, no Jews, and no Catholics. until a more recent history. And slowly, the doors were sort of squeezed open. But this was a measure of the history that I grew up in. And, you know, we just got on with life. Then I should say that throughout both my school periods, it seemed completely normal to me, as Elena was saying, to have Jewish classmates. And when I look back now, they were represented in a much higher percentage than would be in the general population. So 10 to 15 to 20% of my classmates were Jewish. And I regarded this as completely normal until I went to the United States as a student years later, and was quite astonished, a little bit perturbed to find that some people where I was studying didn't know any Jews. I found that quite strange. And so just to give you a sense of my classmates, at junior school, my classmates, the surnames included Glass and Samuels and Kahn and Castle and Lee and Gusowski. And one of my teachers was a Tobiansky. So these were not Catholic. They were all Jews. And my high school, my friends' surnames included Ratzke and Dibowitz and Rainham and Epstein and Siegel and Saker and Gusowski again and Gorin and Fried and Drucker and Friedman and Kaplan and Galgut and Reingold. And then the Catholics were a much more mixed lot if you looked at their surnames. There was Donnelly, and I am only very marginally Catholic. The only Catholic in the entire family was a Scottish grandfather, who I didn't know, who married, shock and horror, he married a Presbyterian whose mother, an Afrikaner, had just come out of the Boer War. This was regarded as a major form of betrayal, to marry somebody from the Roman danger. But Donnelly would be an Irish name, although we have never been to Ireland. But my friends had names like Knight, which were English, and Mulder, which was Afrikaans but Catholic, Dall'Olio, which was Italian, Weindorfer, who was Austrian or German, Zamboni, who was Italian, Mackenzie, who was Scottish. And this represented some of the places Catholics came from. And we had a Catholic, just one teacher at my high school called Taylor, who would have been English, and Jewish teachers. Our music teacher was Miller, Mrs. Miller, and one of our vice principals, Mr. Kessel. It was a little bit different perhaps to your experience in that although we had devotion every day when the school gathered, so 5 minutes or 10 minutes of kind of Christian, you know, how to live a good life, we also had the input of Mrs. Miller, who would speak to us about Jewish feasts. And we learned quite a lot from her, similar to yours when there was scripture class, which was a kind of religion class. This is at a state school. The Jewish students would go to a separate class. But otherwise, we were simply together all the time, and it seemed quite normal. I should say that among the people who looked after me, who was small, when I was small, turned out later to be immigrants, refugees, really, from parts of Eastern Europe, both before and after the wars. And later, I was able to return to this happy kind of friendships. When I moved to Johannesburg and was teaching at the university, my closest neighbor and friend is now a 95-year-old lady from Latvia in Sandringham Gardens, whose family left Riga just weeks before everyone else perished. And so we had a lot to talk about, she and I. And I think I'm partly a priest because of her prayers. She never forgot me in all the years I was away. And she used to worry a lot that I was just doing the right thing. And so for us Catholics then, can I say who were the Jews? Well, other than what I've already said, the Jews we knew were people who took this Friday evening very seriously. This was perhaps our real defining criterion, I think, informally as it was. I knew this because there were certain things that my friends couldn't do on Friday evenings. A close friend of mine in the choir in Cape Town, whose family name was Aronson, it became clear to me when we had a concert on a Friday evening at the University of Cape Town at UCT that he said, well, I can't drive. We can't. And I was a little taken aback. I said, well, you could come to my house if you like. So we did. It was 10 kilometers, so it was a good walk. And I learned something about Sabbath traditions, who also had to cut short a choir tour because, again, it interrupted the Sabbath. We were also aware that our Jewish neighbors and friends often held high positions in the society, in the performing arts world and in all the professions. And when I came to Johannesburg, I'm proud to say that everybody who I've had to call on for everything to do with medical needs, eyes and teeth and everything else, all my doctors are Jews. We were dimly aware that there was a difference between Orthodox and Reformed Jews, but we couldn't have told you exactly what that meant. I was ordained then for the diocese, the Archdiocese of Johannesburg in 2009 after being at this university, and was very happy to return home to my country and to my city, my adopted city. And the second parish I went to was this one, which had this Italian name, Madonna della Strada, Our Lady of the Way, really, of the wayside. And while I was there, it became clear to me that I should get to know the Jewish community better, because on a Friday evening after we came out of our service, I would see our neighbors on their way to the synagogue, and we would greet each other. But it seemed that we should be able to do more than just greet each other. So I needed to ask, after a while, one of my parishioners who works for a very high-profile Jewish CEO of a major company, I needed to ask her who is my closest rabbi. And she said, well, of course, it's Rabbi Goldman. And so we were able to meet, and it's been a great thing to be able to get to know each other a little. And it's been a tremendous enrichment for me. I'm aware that there are various kinds of ties, official and unofficial, between our communities in South Africa, which I'm not part of, and I'm very grateful for that these ties continue. What I do experience on a personal note is that these connections are vital, literally vital. And I know as a Catholic priest that the more I've been able to get to know Jews better over my life, the more I've been able to learn and hopefully to grow in respect and knowledge. I am not a Jew, and there are things in our religions which are different, fundamentally different. But I do know that Catholics who do not understand, as Alina was, I think, saying, the covenant with Israel, with Zion, with the patriarchs, in a way, we become rootless as Catholics. And so, without this, there is something missing in our very being. Various heresies tempt the Christian, and one of them, a very early one from the early centuries, had to do with the abandoning, for some anyway, of the Tanakh, which was to say that since we are people of the New Testament, we don't need the covenant that God made with his chosen people. But the church was quick to reject this. And I think that the tensions in modern South Africa can lie in these directions. Some perhaps who might not be Catholic, and so the superstructure of Catholicism is missing, would delve in a deeper way into the law and the prophets, sometimes coming up with rather original ideas, things that perhaps were never intended. So we have a great flourishing of churches in South Africa called Zionist, which have nothing to do with Israel per se, or with Zion, but are African Zionist churches, which are very independent, very autonomous, and somewhat eclectic, and sometimes quite heterodox in various ways. But a different kind then is of temptation is for Christians who have jettisoned the Old Testament, as we would call it, the covenant, the law and the prophets, and the writings, to become a kind of exclusively New Testament, and that seems to be another kind of challenge and even danger. And so rather the church is mysterious and should flourish and grow. And the two words that stick with me, if I think about my life and the experiences as a Catholic living with Jews, and in the light of this openness that was offered to us by the church in Nostra Aetate, the two words that strike me are memory and integration. I feel that we need to remember, as Catholics, as Christians, we need to remember who we are, where we came from, where we received the faith from. We need to remember our failures too. We need to remember God's mercy to us, to our forefathers, and to us now today. And so the injunction given in the book of Moses in Deuteronomy is for all of us, that we should remember the name of the Lord our God and speak it, whether we are standing or sleeping, unto our children and to our children's children, and never to forget. And then the second word would be a sense that I think is the challenge for South Africa, perhaps of all persuasions, but certainly for us Christians and for Catholics, which is to reintegrate ourselves, to put back together the pieces that were broken, because many pieces were broken in our political history. And part of this is to understand who our neighbors are, who we are too, whatever color, whatever faith. But as Christians, as Catholics, so much of our being in the 1950s, 60s, 70s was defined as a struggle against apartheid, the system of unjust separation. But that's not the be-all and end-all. We need to remember who we are so that we can allow the Almighty to build us back into complete people. And I think this is possible by His grace. And so I give thanks for the relations that I've been able to have in my shorter life, and I hope for many more to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kearns, and thank you very much to Simon Donnelly. It was really interesting what you told us about remembering, about our roots. And so, for our roots, let me introduce here Rabbi Yossi Goldman. He has been the senior minister of Johannesburg's largest Jewish congregation since 1986. He came to South Africa in 1976, and now he is the president of the South Africa Rabbinical Association, having served as its dynamic chairman for 12 years. And he often represents the Jewish faith on radio and television too. Many have been published about of his sermons online with the international website Chabad.org. And his first book, From Where I Stand, was published by TAF Publishing House, and now he's sold out. The second edition is in the pipeline. So we are very grateful to you for being here, and now we are going to listen to your words with a lot of attention.
Yes, Dan. Okay, stand?
Yeah.
Sure, absolutely. I asked if I could stand because I usually stand at the pulpit, so it's, I'm more comfortable, you know.
It's not you. It's not you.
That was quick.
Yeah. It's a university.
You remind me of one of my congregants, Berkowitz, who always falls asleep when I speak during the sermon. And once I got up to the pulpit, and already I see him snoring. I said, Berkowitz, I haven't even opened the Bible yet. He says, Rabbi, I trust you. Okay. So thank you, Dr. Massimo, and my best wishes to Father Philip, who I've been negotiating with about coming here to Rome. It's my wife and I, our first visit to Rome, so it's very special. Carissimi amici, grazie di cuore per il vostro molto cordiale invito. I thank you for the kind and gracious invitation, and I am both humbled and honored, and God bless you. I had an underprivileged childhood. I didn't have one classmate in school named Donnelly or Kearns. They were all Goldberg and Bernstein, Cohen. So I didn't have such a universal background, you know. I come from the ghetto. But Father Simon, Alina, Kevin, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, when I was invited by Professor Father Philip to address the subject of Nostra Aetate tonight, I said to him, why are you asking me? I'm not the chief rabbi of South Africa. Okay, I'm the president of the South African Rabbinical Association. I am the senior minister of the largest Jewish congregation in Johannesburg, but personally, I really have not spent that much time on interfaith relations. My congregation and my own community keep me quite busy as is. But then I thought, maybe I do qualify. You see, every few weeks, I go to visit a nice Italian Catholic gentleman whose name is Alfredo. Alfredo is a hairdresser, a barber. He cuts my hair. And he's been my barber for over 30 years. So on hundreds of occasions, I have sat in a chair, completely defenseless, with a Catholic at my back, with a razor-sharp knife at my neck, and I have never flinched, not once. So I ask you, do Jews and Catholics get along? The truth is, I've enjoyed many interactions with Catholic representatives. For 24 years, I ran the only Jewish radio program in South Africa. It was called The Jewish Sound. Every Sunday night, I produced and presented an hour of Jewish radio between 1976 and 2000. And in this capacity, I was a member of an organization called the Independent Forum of Religious Broadcasters. And I sat on this forum for quite a few years and became very friendly with an Anglican bishop, Hindus, Muslims, and the Catholic representative was a woman named Elsa Strivens, the editor of Trefoil magazine, which I still receive on a regular basis. And then for about 5 years, I sat on the religious broadcasting panel of the South African Broadcasting Corporation, the SABC, the national public broadcaster in South Africa. And a few times a year, we would confer, representatives of all the major religious faiths in South Africa, including the Catholics, of course, and we all got on very well. We had our differences of opinion here and there. One, for example, was I remember that the Christian representatives were most incensed regularly about the blasphemy that occurred on television. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm against blasphemy, obviously. But I was personally actually more concerned and more worried about the repeated and increasing frequency of explicit sex and violence on television, which is corrupting generations of our children big time. And, but we were all on the same page. We were all religious. We were all on the side of God and faith, trying our very best to counter the secular thinking that has come into South Africa since the new democratic dispensation in 1994. President Nelson Mandela, who I had the privilege of meeting on a number of occasions, was a great man. But with the fall of apartheid, the new political freedom brought with it all kinds of freedom, including not only freedom of religion, but freedom from religion, and any of the moral constraints that traditionally come with religion. So all the faith groups, the Jews and the Catholics, were all united in our campaign for a more moral code of broadcasting. And in this group, we ate lunch together. I would get my kosher meal sealed in silver foil, you know. But we became quite friendly. And then there were some very important panel discussions on radio and television over those very important historic years in South Africa. I recall one on the theme of forgiveness. You can imagine that in South Africa, with a history of apartheid and official racial discrimination, that when it ended, there was a lot of forgiveness to be asked. Many people in authority did ask forgiveness. One of the former police chiefs of the old apartheid regime got on his knees and begged forgiveness of some of the victims of apartheid in a very dramatic display. Adriaan Vlok. And so I remember being on a national panel discussion on radio, and there were members of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I was sitting next to the highest ranking Catholic cleric in the country, Cardinal Wilfrid Napier. And so we had our interactions over the years. Every time I would travel to Israel, which was not as often as I would like to, but virtually on every trip, on every El Al plane from Johannesburg to Tel Aviv, there would be a group of Christians going on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And we would have very interesting discussions in the aisles of the plane, usually next to the kitchen. Back in 1983, I was asked to lead my first congregation. I had previously been mainly in education, and then I took my first pulpit. And it was on a campus in the northeastern suburbs of Johannesburg, very near Father Simon's parish. It was bought by the Jewish school known as the Torah Academy, run by the Chabad movement, of which I'm a proud board member. And this property previously housed the Good Shepherd's Convent, which had over the years fallen into disuse. And I remember when the renovations of the building was being now made into a Jewish day school, when the renovations came to the big tower where there was quite a sizable cross on top, I was asked to call the archdiocese and say to them, we're about to do the renovations, what would you like us to do with the religious symbol? We certainly didn't want to do anything that was inappropriate or insensitive. And legend has it that this question went all the way to Rome, because it took a long time for us to get an answer. And eventually they said to us that the ruling was that once it's no longer in Catholic hands, it no longer retains any religious sanctity, and we were free to dispose of it in any way that was convenient. So I'm just sharing with you an interesting interaction. Now, in preparing for this presentation, I spoke to the Chief Rabbi of South Africa, who is a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Warren Goldstein. And he shared with me that his own experience in dealing with Catholic spiritual leaders in South Africa has been both warm and positive. And he mentioned two specific examples. One was that last year, when we were visited by the Chief Rabbi of Israel, Rabbi David Lau, Chief Rabbi Goldstein invited religious leaders from other faiths to come and meet him in Johannesburg, and indeed, the Catholic Archbishop Stephen Brislin flew up especially from Cape Town for the occasion. Perhaps even more telling is the fact that the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, at their conference some 18 months ago in Swaziland, a neighboring country of South Africa, Chief Rabbi Goldstein was invited to address the conference, an invitation which he graciously accepted. But I can safely say that the message of Nostra Aetate has been heard, and more importantly, been acted upon by at least some of the church's representatives. And as you heard a little hint of it earlier, I have the personal testimony to prove it. It was April 2012, and our community had just concluded the festival of Passover. My family and I had just finished cleaning the kitchen. Passover, the Jewish dietary laws, the kosher laws are very different, and we have to change over before Passover, and 8 days later we change back to the regular. It's quite a job. Most of it falls on my good lady, but we try to help. And we had just finished cleaning up after Passover, and I just sat down at the kitchen table to enjoy a cup of coffee. And my bell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. There were no appointments. And I was quite taken aback to see at the front door a Catholic priest. And he was holding a large gift in his hands. I welcomed him in, and that was the first time I had the pleasure of meeting Father Simon Donnelly of the Maryvale Catholic Church, who introduced himself and said he was bringing warm greetings for Passover from his community to mine. And I was most impressed that the card had also writing in Hebrew, Chag Kasher V'Sameach, wishing us a kosher and joyous Passover, written in perfect Hebrew. Well, this had never happened to me before, and I must say I was very touched. And my wife and I invited Father Simon to join me for coffee in the lounge, and we chatted very amiably. And what can I say? You know, sometimes two people don't have a rapport and an understanding, and sometimes you just hit it off. Well, I think we hit it off. And we just happened to click as human beings. And as you heard, when I launched my book, Father Simon was there, and we've had regular chats and communications ever since. And today I can truly say that Father Simon and Rabbi Yossi are good friends. And I value that friendship and pray that it continues and becomes stronger with time. Now, what, you may ask, is the basis of that friendship, of this warm relationship? Is it only that two individual personalities happened to click? We call it divine coincidence. Is it just that the two of us, individuals, happen to be able to establish a good rapport? We've never really talked about it, but I believe it's something which was, although unspoken, was somehow always self-understood by both of us. We both accepted that we have very different beliefs, that we will not necessarily agree on all matters of theological doctrine and dogma, but there is still so much that unites us. So much that binds us together, and that we are both facing common challenges. Here are two spiritual leaders dealing with congregations of regular, ordinary people, families, and households, whether Jews or Catholics, people who are living basically secular lifestyles, where religious values are all too often looked upon as old-fashioned, out of date, out of touch with contemporary society, where people who acknowledge their faith do not necessarily act on that faith, where people may belong to a congregation but not necessarily come to worship all that often, except on perhaps the few holiest days of the year, whether Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur or Christmas and Easter. In fact, part of what drew us together was discovering this very commonality between us. The priest's complaint was that people only called him when they were dying. The rabbi's complaints were very similar. You know, a fellow once asked his rabbi, he says, "Rabbi, what must I do in order to make sure that I die as a Jew?" And the rabbi's answer was very simple. He said, "If you will live like a Jew, I promise you, you will die like a Jew." So Father Simon and I recognize that, of course, there will always be unbridgeable gaps in our very different theologies. But that does not mean that we don't have much more in common. For starters, we're both believers. We both want to see a more moral world, a kinder world, a more sensitive and godly world, where mutual respect and decency can flourish, where peace will finally come to a divided, fragmented, and all too often shattered world. I'll share with you a cute story that I think illustrates this concept. Many years ago, I was still a young rabbi. Excuse me. And I got a call from the local newspaper asking for my comments. What was happening? A new initiative was being planned in Cape Town on the university campus. The students were planning to create one massive center of religious worship. The center would finally put an end to all the infighting, to all the arguments, to all the bickering between the different faiths. It would be a groundbreaking center for religious unity, and it would bring together the three major faiths, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish students, all together in one united house of worship. This unprecedented project was going to be called a Meshuragog, which is a combination of mosque, church, and synagogue, a Meshuragog. So the newspaper wanted to know, what did I think about this grand idea? My answer was that I couldn't understand why each faith had to give up its own beliefs and principles in order to get along with other faiths. Surely this united center would be neither a mosque, nor a church, nor a synagogue, but perhaps a superficial smattering of each, which would clearly leave no one really satisfied. And the whole idea seemed to me to be based on John Lennon's famous song, Imagine. And a song where there are no religions, and no nationalities, and no borders, just one big world at peace. And it sounds so wonderful and blissful and beautiful, even though it might be not only hopelessly naive, but just plain wrong. Why should anyone have to compromise their own faith to get on with someone from another faith? Brought with it all kinds of freedom, including not only freedom of religion, but freedom from religion, and any of the moral constraints that traditionally come with religion. So all the faith groups, the Jews and the Catholics, were all united in our campaign for a more moral code of broadcasting. And in this group, we ate lunch together. I would get my kosher meal sealed in silver foil, you know. But we became quite friendly. And then there were some very important panel discussions on radio and television over those very important historic years in South Africa. I recall one on the theme of forgiveness. You can imagine that in South Africa, with a history of apartheid and official racial discrimination, that when it ended, there was a lot of forgiveness to be asked. Many people in authority did ask forgiveness. One of the former police chiefs of the old apartheid regime got on his knees and begged forgiveness of some of the victims of apartheid in a very dramatic display. Adriaan Vlok. And so I remember being on a national panel discussion on radio, and there were members of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I was sitting next to the highest ranking Catholic cleric in the country, Cardinal Wilfred Napier. And so we had our interactions over the years. Every time I would travel to Israel, which was not as often as I would like to, but virtually on every trip, on every El Al plane from Johannesburg to Tel Aviv, there would be a group of Christians going on pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And we would have very interesting discussions in the aisles of the plane, usually next to the kitchen. Back in 1983, I was asked to lead my first congregation. I had previously been mainly in education, and then I took my first pulpit. And it was on a campus in the northeastern suburbs of Johannesburg, very near Father Simon's parish. It was bought by the Jewish school known as the Torah Academy, run by the Chabad movement, of which I'm a proud board member. And this property previously housed the Good Shepherd's Convent, which had over the years fallen into disuse. And I remember when the renovations of the building was being now made into a Jewish day school, when the renovations came to the big tower where there was quite a sizable cross on top, I was asked to call the archdiocese and say to them, we're about to do the renovations, what would you like us to do with the religious symbol? We certainly didn't want to do anything that was inappropriate or insensitive. And legend has it that this question went all the way to Rome, because it took a long time for us to get an answer. And eventually they said to us that the ruling was that once it's no longer in Catholic hands, it no longer retains any religious sanctity, and we were free to dispose of it in any way that was convenient. So I'm just sharing with you an interesting interaction. Now, in preparing for this presentation, I spoke to the Chief Rabbi of South Africa, who is a friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Warren Goldstein. And he shared with me that his own experience in dealing with Catholic spiritual leaders in South Africa has been both warm and positive. And he mentioned two specific examples. One was that last year, when we were visited by the Chief Rabbi of Israel, Rabbi David Lau, Chief Rabbi Goldstein invited religious leaders from other faiths to come and meet him in Johannesburg, and indeed, the Catholic Archbishop Stephen Brislin flew up especially from Cape Town for the occasion. Perhaps even more telling is the fact that the Southern African Catholic Bishops' Conference, at their conference some 18 months ago in Swaziland, a neighboring country of South Africa, Chief Rabbi Goldstein was invited to address the conference, an invitation which he graciously accepted. But I can safely say that the message of Nostra Aetate has been heard, and more importantly, been acted upon by at least some of the church's representatives. And as you heard a little hint of it earlier, I have the personal testimony to prove it. It was April 2012, and our community had just concluded the festival of Passover. My family and I had just finished cleaning the kitchen. Passover, the Jewish dietary laws, the kosher laws are very different, and we have to change over before Passover, and 8 days later we change back to the regular. It's quite a job. Most of it falls on my good lady, but we try to help. And we had just finished cleaning up after Passover, and I just sat down at the kitchen table to enjoy a cup of coffee. And my bell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. There were no appointments. And I was quite taken aback to see at the front door a Catholic priest. And he was holding a large gift in his hands. I welcomed him in, and that was the first time I had the pleasure of meeting Father Simon Donnelly of the Maryvale Catholic Church, who introduced himself and said he was bringing warm greetings for Passover from his community to mine. And I was most impressed that the card had also writing in Hebrew, Chag Kasher V'Sameach, wishing us a kosher and joyous Passover, written in perfect Hebrew. Well, this had never happened to me before, and I must say I was very touched. And my wife and I invited Father Simon to join me for coffee in the lounge, and we chatted very amiably. And what can I say? You know, sometimes two people don't have a rapport and an understanding, and sometimes you just hit it off. Well, I think we hit it off. And we just happened to click as human beings. And as you heard, when I launched my book, Father Simon was there, and we've had regular chats and communications ever since. And today I can truly say that Father Simon and Rabbi Yossi are good friends. And I value that friendship and pray that it continues and becomes stronger with time. Now, what, you may ask, is the basis of that friendship, of this warm relationship? Is it only that two individual personalities happened to click? We call it divine coincidence. Is it just that the two of us individuals happen to be able to establish a good rapport? We've never really talked about it, but I believe it's something which was, although unspoken, was somehow always self-understood by both of us. We both accepted that we have very different beliefs, that we will not necessarily agree on all matters of theological doctrine and dogma, but there is still so much that unites us, so much that binds us together, and that we are both facing common challenges. Here are two spiritual leaders dealing with congregations of regular, ordinary people, families, and households, whether Jews or Catholics, people who are living basically secular lifestyles, where religious values are all too often looked upon as old-fashioned, out of date, out of touch with contemporary society, where people who acknowledge their faith do not necessarily act on that faith, where people may belong to a congregation but not necessarily come to worship all that often, except on perhaps the few holiest days of the year, whether Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur or Christmas and Easter. In fact, part of what drew us together was discovering this very commonality between us. The priest's complaint was that people only called him when they were dying. The rabbi's complaints were very similar. You know, a fellow once asked his rabbi, he says, "Rabbi, what must I do in order to make sure that I die as a Jew?" And the rabbi's answer was very simple. He said, "If you will live like a Jew, I promise you, you will die like a Jew." So Father Simon and I recognize that, of course, there will always be unbridgeable gaps in our very different theologies. But that does not mean that we don't have much more in common. For starters, we're both believers. We both want to see a more moral world, a kinder world, a more sensitive and godly world, where mutual respect and decency can flourish, where peace will finally come to a divided, fragmented, and all too often shattered world. I'll share with you a cute story that I think illustrates this concept. Many years ago, I was still a young rabbi. Excuse me. And I got a call from the local newspaper asking for my comments. What was happening? A new initiative was being planned in Cape Town on the university campus. The students were planning to create one massive center of religious worship. The center would finally put an end to all the infighting, to all the arguments, to all the bickering between the different faiths. It would be a groundbreaking center for religious unity, and it would bring together the three major faiths, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish students, all together in one united house of worship. This unprecedented project was going to be called a Meshuragog, which is a combination of mosque, church, and synagogue. A Meshuragog. So the newspaper wanted to know, what did I think about this grand idea? My answer was that I couldn't understand why each faith had to give up its own beliefs and principles in order to get along with other faiths. Surely this united center would be neither a mosque, nor a church, nor a synagogue, but perhaps a superficial smattering of each, which would clearly leave no one really satisfied. And the whole idea seemed to me to be based on John Lennon's famous song, Imagine. And a song where there are no religions, and no nationalities, and no borders, just one big world at peace. And it sounds so wonderful and blissful and beautiful, even though it might be not only hopelessly naive, but just plain wrong. Why should anyone have to compromise their own faith to get on with someone from another faith? The great synagogue here in Rome and Israel. And he has now, with immense courage, gone still further by saying that it is no longer necessary to evangelize the Jews. For the church, surely this was nothing short of historic. And so it is therefore my hope and prayer that the church leaders will continue on this path of respect and goodwill, of brotherhood and reconciliation. It is not easy to undo many centuries of disdain, of looking at Jews as villains and infidels. And it has been most encouraging that over the last 50 years, much significant progress has been made. We Jews are, thankfully, no longer the enemy. And as we have seen dramatic pronouncements in more recent times, expressions of friendship and understanding towards the Jewish people, it is my personal hope and prayer that the leadership will go still further. Firstly, with regard to Israel, and I quote just this week, don't know if you saw Newsweek magazine published an essay by the former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom, Lord Jonathan Sacks. And the headline was, "Anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism." And it is therefore my prayer that the church will help us, will help Israel in the fight to defend it against cynical, hypocritical enemies who demonize Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, a country who has steadfastly protected Christian houses of worship like no other in the region. And I hope that that relationship between Israel and the Vatican will strengthen, because Israel deserves its help. And secondly, as to me, personally, and it seems a rather logical outcome of the recent pronouncements of Pope Francis about not missionizing to the Jews, I say that, and I say it again, I speak personally as the son of a survivor of the Holocaust. I look forward to the day when I hear church leaders say aloud for all to hear that the Jewish martyrs of the Holocaust, including my own family, including well over 1 million young, pure, innocent children, that they too have a place in eternity, and that they too are reposing in the bliss of paradise, not purgatory, in heaven and not in hell. And I hope that they would do it without resorting to the absurd and audacious solution that was promulgated a few years ago by the Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, in Utah. I don't know if you heard about it, but it was a most ridiculous, shameless, and condescending solution of that church. They decided to baptize the 6 million Jews martyred in the Holocaust. They decided to baptize them posthumously without asking their permission. We Jews have a word for that. It's called chutzpah. Monumental chutzpah. So I don't think that we need to resort to that. My friends, all of us have been created in the image of God. Every human being on planet Earth is a proud bearer of the distinct image of God, our Creator. At the end of the day, Nostra Aetate has been formulated by the Catholics and for the Catholics. Do I, as a Jew, sleep better since Nostra Aetate? To be honest, I cannot say that I do. I've always been a proud Jew. But we certainly do value and appreciate these dramatic positive changes over the last 50 years, and we certainly do hope and pray that the Church will continue along this road of tolerance and reconciliation and successfully reach out to get that message across to all its people, all its clergy, all its lay people, so that they too can embrace and share in these important principles. We have heard wonderful talks from Father Simon and Alina, but it's not enough for the Father Simons of the world to embrace Nostra Aetate. It is vitally important that this dramatic message filters down to the ordinary man and woman on the streets of Rome and on the streets of Johannesburg, and indeed throughout the entire world. You know what happened when I told my father on the telephone the other day that I was invited by the Gregorian Pontifical University to speak in Rome? My father, he said in Yiddish, Moshiach's Zeiten. It's the times of the Messiah. So it is indeed my hope and prayer that this historic process of reconciliation will be a harbinger of the fulfillment of the prophecies of Isaiah concerning the Messianic age. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The wolf will dwell with the lamb, the leopard will lie down with the kid. For the earth shall be as filled with the knowledge of God as the waters that cover the sea. And let us all say, Amen. Grazie per l'ascolto, che il Signore vi benedica tutti. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Grazie a lei. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now we have some time more for questions. And please ask what you want. I think we have 15 minutes. Okay.
Thank you very much, Rabbi, for your encouraging talk, and also to the rest of the speakers. This is more of just a very simple question. I don't have any great theological illuminations, but Father Simon, if you could just give us a brief, what made you go over to begin this friendship with the rabbi? If you could give us a little, because it can maybe help us take that first step.
I've not no particularly wise words. You know, the parish that I was pastor of for 2 years, the one I've mentioned, the area used to be called Piccola Italia, Little Italy, because it was just Italian. Families were in charge of streets, isn't that true? Literally. And you know, different parts of Italy, different dialects.
I remember when Italy won the World Cup, we couldn't get through the streets.
So now the problem with the streets is different. It depends. No, so the point is, it was, I guess, a sort of an Italian stronghold, or at least a Catholic one in many ways. And you know, things have developed and moved. People have emigrated and have sometimes fewer children and so forth. And I used to say to my parishioners, the reason that we're still in business, at least security-wise, is thanks to our Jewish neighbors. But seriously, you know, it's a major Jewish hub in South Africa, and it just seemed we can't just pass each other like ships in the night. I mean, we should be able to say more than hello, and the relations were cordial. I have to tell you how it began. The rabbi kind of knows this, I think. It began with something mundane, which is kind of Catholic and Jewish in a weird way. I got a phone call one day from a neighbor who was complaining very gently, very gently. And I didn't really get back to the person, which I was stupid about. And some months later, her husband phoned and also complained very gently. And the reason they were complaining was the following. In our church, I'm not the parish priest anymore, we had 2 bell towers. And so we had this funny Catholic idea of following the Jewish timetable for the day. And so the Catholic way would be to ring the bells at the 1st hour, the 6th hour, and the 12th hour. So we prayed the Angelus. The angel of the Lord declared unto Mary. We would pray this at 6 in the morning when we had Holy Mass, because the schedule of Mass has changed, and at midday and in the evening. And so it struck, I was able to go around to the family, and we had some really nice conversations, and it turned out this was really South Africa's leading female composer, who was a professor of music and head of department at the university, and we knew people in common and so forth. So we had these conversations. And then the family invited me around to Shabbos one evening, and when I needed to know who I should go to, and could I really bother the rabbi at this time of night, they said, sure. He's not at shul anymore. He will have gone home. They said, Pesach is finished. But you could go to his house. I do think that when I went to your house and knocked on the gate, I think maybe your family thought it was like Halloween or fancy dress, because you don't see many priests wandering around in the dark in Johannesburg. Anyway, but seriously, there was just a sense that it was no profound insight, but we should know each other. And you had all kinds of insights too. You said, you remembered walking past the church one evening, and it was my predecessor, Father Peter Holliday, who was a bishop of another diocese, and you said it struck you as kind of a father talking to his family. He was standing at the top of the steps of the church. So, we need to do, I felt anyway, we could do a lot more than just be near each other. And, it's just little things, right? That's it.
I don't think there was necessarily anything profoundly theological, but a very simple human gesture, which is godly at the end of the day. Thank you.
For me, it was just, I always grew up amongst the Jewish people, so it was just very natural for me to be in and out of the homes from a very young child. We were surrounded by neighbors, so there was no difference for me at all.
We should say that in South Africa, this is an unusual situation. I mean, large parts of the country would never have known Jews, and some parts where there was certainly no Catholics. In the African community, I mean, people might, they might know Jewish families through work, but not, except for a very small phenomenon, right, of people who may or may not have kind of Jewish ancestry amongst some as a part of an African community in South Africa. But other than that, I think it would be, it's not an even distribution. Johannesburg it's a massive urban phenomenon. It's like Rome, and so everybody's thrown together. I should say that in downtown Johannesburg, the Catholic cathedral built in 1960, and the Catholics decided to stay and to renovate it. The downtown was being emptied in various ways. It was really for a long time opposite the Great Synagogue, which was the seat of Jews in Johannesburg. So we were not, we'd known each other for a long time, long before I was on the scene.
I'll just add to that that it's ironic and very telling that this relationship is developing in South Africa, of all places, where for decades there was a government-legislated system known as, quote, separate development, keeping different nationalities, different races apart. In fact, from a very selfish Jewish perspective, apartheid had a positive spin-off for each of the smaller groupings and nationalities and identities that separate development was the government policy. So you could stick to your own and stay within your own community and not become assimilated and lose your identity, which could, from that small, narrow, selfish vantage point was beneficial. But interestingly, that in a country where separate development and keeping everybody apart, from that history, that the Rainbow Nation now, which I think was coined by Desmond Tutu, if I'm not mistaken, that I think he coined the phrase Rainbow Nation. I'm not sure. Okay, unfortunately, we both wear black, so it's not much of a rainbow. But at the same time, it does reflect that philosophy.
I think we have two more questions, 1 and 2. I think we can do both questions and then wait for the answer.
I'm not so sure about Johannesburg, but I'm a Cape Townian. So one of the things that strikes me about the community, the Jewish community in Cape Town, is that it seems to be disappearing. I remember a time when Sea Point, for example, was almost a Jewish state. And now it's not. And I'd like to know, is it that many South African Jews have left South Africa? Or is it that there is increased secularization in the Jewish community so that we're not seeing that visibility? Or is it that the Jewish community has, in some sense, for want of a better phrase, gone underground, that it's not as prominent, not as visible as it used to be? There seems to me to be a diminishment in the, certainly in Cape Town, of the Jewish community, and it's puzzled me for some time.
Yes.
Maybe this goes well with that question. I was just going to ask you, Rabbi, what your vision was for a future relationship. I mean, what would your hope be, but what's possible between the religious communities?
Thank you. Rabbi.
Okay, so first things first, as far as Cape Town is concerned, the Jewish community has been affected by emigration in the same as the rest of the country. From a racial point of view, we're part of the white community, generally speaking. And we have lost over the last 30 years, 40 years, 1/3 of our population in South Africa. My own congregation was, there was a waiting list to get in 30 years ago. Today we have some spare seats, you know. I have a congregation of 1,400 seats. It's only full a few days a year. But, so part of it is emigration. But in fact, Cape Town Jewry is quite strong and actually getting stronger. What may be noticeable on the surface is maybe the outer dress is more in line with what everybody else looks like. You don't see too many of the old-fashioned Jews with hats and so on. But there are a growing number of synagogues, kosher food establishments in Sea Point. Sea Point is still I would say, a busy, vibrant Jewish community. My wife and I have 4 children living in Cape Town at the moment.
3 of whom are rabbis or married to rabbis. One is a cantor in the great synagogue. And they're all involved in a new renaissance of Cape Town Jewry. Ironically, my one daughter is, her husband's the rabbi of the great synagogue, the Garden Shul, which is the mother synagogue this year celebrating its 175th anniversary. I know in Rome that's a youngster, but in South Africa it's the oldest synagogue. And the other daughter has started a new community from scratch in Bloberg on the west coast, past Milnerton. So, and my younger son has just become the student rabbi on UCT, on the campus. So there is growth, and your perception I would not take as a negative prognosis of any kind. But, okay. So, again, there may be less numbers, less visibility, but it's, thank God, vibrant and in many ways growing. Certainly qualitatively, if not quantitatively. As far as the future, I don't know, we have to actually sit down and have a meeting, you know, how to plan the future. There's no official plan, you know. Our relationship is largely personal. Obviously, we each represent a movement, but thus far, we've done it really in our personal capacities. If and how we take it to an organizational level, perhaps something we might want to discuss. There's no strategy at the moment. But as I said in my address, I really do hope that the church has a plan and a vision of getting the message of Nostra Aetate down to the grassroots. I hope. I don't know. You know, it's not my area of expertise. Maybe someone can tell us. Is there a system, or is it just edicts that get pronounced and have to be acted on by someone? I have no idea.
So here we need an expert on. Yeah, there's whole swathes of parts of the church which deal with this. So we have so you mentioned Cardinal Koch is in Israel, who's in Poland, but who would be responsible for all of the, in a sense, the official relationship with the other Christian churches, but also with Jews. So there's a great deal of energy and love and time, and it's not just at the level of sort of nice documents, but I think very much projects around the world. But I cannot speak.
But that's relevant. Father Philip, who invited me, apologized that he's not here tonight because he's in Warsaw at a meeting with leading Israeli rabbis. Is that correct? Yes. Which happens every 2 years or something? Every 2 years. You want to tell us more about it? I don't know.
And just, I mean, there are probably scholars right here in this room of the Second Vatican Council and of documents of the Council, and Nostra Aetate just being one of the number of documents which expressed a spirit of renewal and of deepening of various things and returning to ad fontes for our own sources, returning to the roots of Scripture and of liturgy and all kinds of things, I think, in the life of the Christian people. And one of this is what we're referring to. So I think, Nostra Aetate has been talked about a lot, certainly in the last year because of the 50 years, but I don't know how it extends to other Christian communities around the world, but certainly Catholics take this quite seriously, when it's not at the level of being mandated to do things, but it becomes the transmission of the faith and the expression of the faith, and so it's important, and it's certainly been regarded as important since Pope John and Pope Paul VI, who promulgated it, and his successors, each of them, in quite distinct ways, in a way by chance, but has had very deep relations personally before even becoming Pope with Jews. Again, this is not all up to the papacy. It's up to, and that's what your point, I think, is, right? It's up to men and women on the ground, on the street. And I think a lot of Catholics, certainly around the world, certainly in my anecdotal experience, take these things quite seriously, you know. So they regard this as a direction which is definitely for all Christians, all Catholics, and that this is not just a footnote, but this is the way things are, you know, and should be. And I think often it is personal relationships that I know nothing about, but are being, you know, you refer to them, you're growing up, but in other parts of the English-speaking world, other parts of the world, period, you know, and I'm sure there's plenty to be done, and healing to be done, but I think there's a lot which is already on the way, you know, in progress. Yeah, I can't speak for the church is a big place.
I loved hearing all of you, and I want to thank you for that. I just want to say that perhaps in each family becomes a community, becomes the world, and if each of us teach our own families, our children, our communities, the 7 Noahide laws out there for the world, and people are proud of knowing what the 7 Noahide laws are for each family, we'd have a much more peaceful world, respectful world, whereas Jews would learn their own. Many Jews are assimilated and don't know their own laws. So if Jews will learn their laws and Catholics will learn their laws, and we will all build on ourselves, I think the world will just be a much better place where everybody will have more respect for each other, and add one more act of goodness and kindness, and it'll be a better world.
Amen.
So, thank you. It was, I think, a wonderful way to end this series of lectures. Let me remember that the concert will not be held in May, but next autumn. And let me thank, grazie mille to Mrs. Kearns, grazie Simon Donnelly, and thank you very much Rabbi Goldman. Grazie a voi per essere venuti, thank you for being here, and good night, buona serata a tutti.